Welcome to ThePhysicaledEducator.com's visual guide to Purposeful Phys Ed. So what is Purposeful Phys Ed? Well, Purposeful Phys Ed is a 10-step workflow that I've created to help make sure that my students are focused on and mastering curriculum objectives. In this video, I'll go over the 10 steps of Purposeful Phys Ed and show you how I break down my curriculum grade level outcomes and use them as the core of my teaching. That being said, let's get into step 1 of Purposeful Phys Ed, Triage. When I first took a look at my grade level outcomes document, I found it to be very overwhelming. I mean, there were so many outcomes I was expected to reach with my students within a school year. And visualizing all those outcomes at once was very intimidating. So to make the task a little bit less daunting, what I decided to do was, starting with my youngest grade, grade 1, I eliminated all of the outcomes that were not expected to be introduced or mastered in grade 1 or the years directly following it. Almost immediately, the document seemed less scary to work with. By the time I got to step 2, matching, I still had a lot of outcomes that I was expected to reach with my students. However, I noticed that I would never have had time to plan a full unit for each one of those outcomes. So I decided to look at any outcomes that would work well together, meaning that they would be easily taught together, and match those outcomes. What happened is I wound up having these banks of outcomes that I could then work with. In step 3, activity selection, I then went back to those groups of outcomes that I had highlighted in step 2 and decided, okay, which activity would be best suited to reach these outcomes? That's how I select the activities I teach throughout a year, as opposed to just being like, okay, I want to teach soccer, I want to teach dance this year, and trying to find curriculum outcomes that would fit in those. I start with the outcomes first and then select the activities. Now that I know which outcomes I'll be focusing on and which activities I'll be using to focus on them, it's time for me to create my evaluation criteria. I do this by using those very outcomes from the grade level outcomes document and then break them down further into objective, observable aspects. So for example, if I was teaching a net and wall games unit and my evaluation criteria was defend space, my observable aspects could be moves to where the object will land and positions him or herself in the middle of their area. These observable aspects are what are going to help me understand the degree to which students are mastering the learning outcomes from our curriculum. Now that I know the outcomes I'll be focusing on, the activities I'll be using to focus on them, and the criteria I'll be using to evaluate my students' progress, it's time to get into unit planning. Now my unit planning is very basic. Using the outcomes from the curriculum as the focus for each lesson, I simply write down what my lesson objectives are, the assessment tools I'll need, and the main lesson activities I'll be using within that lesson. This unit planning is very basic because I will be getting into more detailed lesson planning later on. However, I do want to have an idea of how many lessons I'm going to need for each unit. And the reason for that is that because in step 6, mapping, I'm going to be taking these units that I've just outlined and I will be placing them into my school calendar, making sure that there's a good balance in the type of outcomes I'll be focusing on within each term. So now that that is all done, I'm going to go back to my first unit in the school year and start planning out my assessment tools. So remember that I'm using the grade level outcomes from my curriculum as evaluation criteria. And using that evaluation criteria, I'm going to build my rubrics, peer assessment forms, self-assessment forms, and any other kind of tool that I will need to collect data on my students' progress throughout the unit. So now I'm ready to get into lesson planning. So I'm going to go back to those unit outlines that I created earlier in the year, and I'm going to create an elaborate lesson plan for that first lesson in the unit. It's very important to note that everything that I put into that lesson plan is going to be tied directly back to the lesson focus, so that way there I know that everything is tied directly back to that learning outcome from my curriculum. I won't go and plan the other lessons of that unit just yet, because I'm going to wait until after lesson 1, once I've collected some information on where my students are at in their learning, so that I can tailor lesson 2 and all the other lessons around my students' needs. So now I'm ready to get into step 9, which is the actual fun teaching part of Purposeful Phys Ed. So I go into each of my lessons very clear as to what my evaluation criteria are. I also make sure that my students are aware of those evaluation criteria so they know that what they're focusing on for that day. I have a detailed lesson plan with activities that are aligned with my curriculum. I have assessment tools that are ready to help me collect data on where my students are at in their progress. And finally, I've got this great feeling knowing that everything I'm going to do in class that day is going to help my students master the learning objectives from our curriculum. Now that all the teaching and assessment's done, it's time for evaluation. I go into every Purposeful Phys Ed lesson ready to teach, assess, use information, and provide meaningful feedback to my students. I know that by the end of a unit, I've collected as much information on my students' progress as possible. All of this allows me to produce a final grade for my students that's going to give them a clear indication of the extent to which they mastered the outcomes that we originally set out to master. And that is Purposeful Phys Ed. I hope you've enjoyed this video and that it's given you a better idea of how I go about my curriculum mapping, planning, teaching, assessment, and evaluation. It might seem like a very tedious process, but I guarantee you that there's no better feeling than knowing that everything you're doing as a teacher and everything your students are doing in class has a purpose. If you'd like to learn more about Purposeful Phys Ed, please go to our blog at thephysicaleducator.com/blog. While you're there, check out some of the other cool stuff we're doing at thephysicaleducator.com. Our goal is to help you be the best teacher that you can be, and I hope that this Purposeful Phys Ed video has helped inspire you in some way. Thank you so much for watching, and happy teaching.